Thank you. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be here again. And thanks for the very nice introduction. Today's talk is actually going to be entirely descriptive. So there's nothing estimated really in this talk. There's a bit of smoothing of the data, but nothing about causal inference with nonlinear probability models. Okay, so the origins of what I'm going to talk about today come from a paper that I published with 3 co-authors back in 2009, and that paper was called Non-Persistent Inequality in Education, or something along those lines. And what we found was that over birth cohorts in the 20th century in Europe, the association between social origin and educational attainment had weakened. And you might think, well, that's no big deal, but actually it was, because it went against the prevailing belief among stratification scholars, which was that this relationship had remained constant across the century despite all the changes that had occurred in education and in society. And when we finished that paper, we thought it would then be interesting to extend that work to look at how changes in the association between social origins and education might have affected intergenerational mobility. In other words, the association between social origins and social destinations. And what I'm going to present today are some results from that project. So this project involved a large number of people who are all listed there. And we looked at trends in social mobility and in education in those 8 countries, so 7 European countries and the US. But today I'm just going to focus on 5 countries. I'm going to focus on Germany, France, the Netherlands, Sweden, and the US. The 4 European countries there I've used because those are the countries in which we have the most comparable variables measurement. 2 of those countries are well known as being quite open in the sense of having high rates of relative mobility. That's the Netherlands and Sweden. And 2 of them are known as being quite closed. That's Germany and France. Although this paper or this work began with the idea of looking at the role of education in intergenerational mobility, it of course grew, and what I'm going to talk about today is more generally trends in intergenerational mobility in the 20th century. But I am going to look at education as well. Okay, so let me just say how we did this. We adopted, of course, this social class perspective, in which we assign people and their fathers to social classes using this well-known EGP schema. There's that word fathers there. What happened to mothers? Well, because we use data that comes from surveys going back to the early 1970s, many surveys at that time didn't ask any questions about mothers' occupation. Even in Sweden, they didn't start asking this question in the survey series that we use until the 1990s. So we're having to rely for our measure of social class origins on father's occupation. And we've used these 7 classes, which are standard in the literature, so I'm not going to go into them. We categorize education into these 5 groups using another kind of cross-national educational schema, which makes distinctions both between level and between vocational and general education. Mostly today I'm going to be concentrating on 3A and 3B. So lower tertiary there would mean mostly technical education. So this would be, for those of you who know anything about European education systems, these would be things like Fachhochschulen in Germany and their equivalent in Sweden, the Netherlands, and France. And what we're going to do is we're going to compare the social mobility of men and women in 6 birth cohorts. Basically, the first birth cohort is people born between about 1916 and 1925, and the last birth cohort is people born between about 1965 and 72. We're going to look at people who are aged between either 30 or 35 and 65 or 70. And what we've used here is multiple survey data sets from each country collected between the 70s and the 2000s. So for social class destination, this is based on the occupation that these people reported when they were interviewed. We're not talking here about panel data, we're talking about essentially repeated cross-sections. So we've extracted birth cohorts from each of those. So we are also able, as well as focusing on cohort effects, we can also look at age effects, or we can look at cohort effects and period effects. I'm not going to say anything about, there are really no important period effects. There are some age effects which I could talk more about, but I'll skip that for now. The samples then are quite large. They're mostly over 100,000 people. But of course, they tend to be a bit sparse in the oldest and the youngest cohorts. So I haven't shown standard errors in anything that I'm going to present today, but you should bear in mind that what I'm showing is most reliable for the cohorts in the middle. And the goal here isn't so much to compare levels across countries, levels of intergenerational mobility. The goal is simply to compare the trajectories through time to see whether the same kinds of things happened in different countries or whether they diverge in interesting ways. Let me just say something about why we adopt the class approach. As you all know, there's been a huge growth in the amount of interest in intergenerational mobility over the past, well, I guess in the US over the past 15 years, let's say, in Britain over the past 25 years. But we know surprisingly little about trends in intergenerational mobility. That's partly because you can't really find out these things in respect of intergenerational income mobility because there's no way of capturing that data, even in countries that have registered data, like Sweden. That generally only goes back to about the 1960s. So information on income, for example, in the Swedish register starts in the 1950s. What we do know about social classes is that you can ask people what was the occupation of their father, and if you group that into classes, that measure is highly reliable. So we have done work with a kind of a test-retest design, and we do find very high reliability for people's reports of their parents' social class. People's reports of their parents' incomes, of course, would be highly unreliable. So that's why we adopt this class perspective. And just finally, before I get going on the results, we make this distinction between absolute mobility and relative mobility. So absolute mobility is really all about percentages who are mobile and so on, and the actual up and downward moves. Relative mobility is really to do with the association between origins and destinations. So this is sometimes called the association net of the marginal distributions of origins and destinations. And this relative mobility is usually captured in terms of odds ratios, so large odds ratio. The odds ratio is, in a way, very similar to the intergenerational elasticity. So a large value means low what's called social fluidity, meaning origins are strongly associated with destinations. So this relative mobility is often called social fluidity. Social fluidity is often taken as a kind of a measure of societal openness, since it does capture the degree to which the destination you end up in is associated with the place you started from. And of course, it's often equated with equality of opportunity. Right? So the idea is that this association, there should be no association if there's perfect equality of opportunity. That's too simplistic, of course. That's not actually true, because after all, we're looking at outcomes, not opportunities. But it is widely considered to be at least some approximate index of equality of opportunity. So if you want to think of social fluidity in that way, that's fine. Okay, so what do we know about the 20th century and what happened in the 20th century? Well, we know that it was a time in which societies that were mostly based around agriculture at the turn of the century, or at least had large shares of their population in agriculture, they first shifted towards industry, and then they moved towards services. They started at different points, of course. Britain wasn't agricultural at all in 1900. I think only 3% of the labour force were in agriculture in 1900. But a country like Sweden had very large shares of the population in agriculture, as did France and many other European countries. But what we see in our data then is this big structural shift that occurred during the 20th century. Along the x-axis, we've got 6 birth cohorts. And what we're plotting here on the one hand is the percentage of men who are in the top 2 social classes. So these are often called the service class, which doesn't mean service as in working at McDonald's. It means service as in terms of higher professional, higher managerial service in the sense of the tertiary sector. So we see this growth in the percentage of men in those classes, and if we look at the bottom class, which is the unskilled manual class, we see a decline. And the key there is that the US is in red, Germany is in black, the Dutch are in orange, the Swedes are in green, and the French are blue. These trends are rather similar. Okay, there's a bit of a difference here with the Dutch. But I think what's quite noticeable is that the growth, except for the Netherlands, basically stops in about the 1945-54 cohort. So this big upskilling or upgrading of the class structure stops. And the opposite, of course, is true with the unskilled manual class. We see something similar among women, except the growth of women going into these top classes actually continues rather longer, and their decline in unskilled manual jobs is also more consistent across the whole of the 6 birth cohorts. The consequence of this then is that we see trends in upward and downward mobility that very closely mirror these changes in the class structure. So these trends in upward mobility have a very characteristic inverted U shape. So upward mobility becomes more and more common up to the cohorts born around the middle of the century, and then after that it begins to decline. Downward mobility becomes less common to those same cohorts, and then after that it starts to increase again. And there's the picture for women. It's similar, but rather than upward mobility declining and downward mobility increasing, they rather stay flat after this period. One thing that I should have said is these are based on men and women who are in the labour force. So when we're looking at the data for women, we have to be aware that, of course, the selection of women into the labour force is changing. And that's why I think you're going to see some different trends for men and for women. Okay, so that's upward and downward mobility. What about the association between origins and destinations? So this thing that we call social fluidity. Well, what we've done here is we haven't got a measure of social fluidity. Okay. Yep.
Volume-wise?
Am I okay volume-wise? No, up. Somebody.
Right next to this.
Okay, I'll stand closer. Yeah. Okay, thanks. We haven't got a measure of social fluidity itself, but we've got a measure of how it changed over time, because we're not, as I say, we're not comparing countries here. So we're taking pre-1924 as having a value of 1. So if you think of the association, whatever it is, being scaled then by a single number, as we move to later cohorts, then this association is being scaled downwards. So there's a weakening association between origins and destinations. For this, we've used what's called unidiff, or the log multiplicative layer effect, But we've used non-parametric measures. They all give exactly the same trend. But again, there's rather a distinctive break, I think, at the 1945-54 cohort. So fluidity is increasing up to that point. After that, it's pretty much flat. There's not a whole lot going on. Well, that's men. This is women. We have so few observations of women in the labour force in Germany in the two first cohorts that we don't even use that data. For women, I think you see a more consistent downward trend, which actually lasts until at least the 55 to 64 cohort. But here, the US is a bit different. So social fluidity among women seems to have increased up to about people born in the late 30s. But then after that, it seems to have remained flat. Okay. If we just quickly go on to education, of course, we all know this was also a period in which education expanded. Elementary education is here our lowest category. As you can see, in a country like France, 1 ABC there is the lowest category. In France, at the start of the century, very few people had anything beyond compulsory education. And compulsory education at that time was something like 6 or 7 years of education. So there's been a huge change in those countries. On the right-hand side, we see the situation for the tertiary education. We see then that corresponding growth. We see the same picture for women here, decline of elementary, increase of tertiary. But what we found in our 2009 paper was that it was this thing which had changed. So this is now the association between class origins and educational attainment measured in those 5 categories that I showed you at the start. And here you can see this very pronounced downward trend. So the association is getting weaker. Social origins had less effect on the education you attained, except in the US, where there seems to be an initial decline, but I don't think we can put a huge amount of weight on that because the first cohort is quite small and basically kind of flat after that. So this is not new, I think, in the US context. The rest of it, the decline, was what we reported in our 2009 paper. But again, some suggestion that once you get to the later cohorts, things are flattening out, right? This trend is not persisting throughout the entire century. And then this is the same picture for women. It's very similar, except now among women in the US, it does appear that there was a fairly consistent weakening of the relationship between origins and education. Okay, we can look at some of these things in more detail. I'm not going to say much about this, but for example, this is looking at it in terms of moving averages. This is the Swedish case. And here I think we can get perhaps a clearer indication of when these changes were occurring and a clearer indication of when they stopped. And so you can see it's around about 1950 that the solid line, which is the OD association, flattens out among men. And a lot of the OE weakening is actually in the earlier birth cohorts, as we saw. And this is the same picture for women, where you have much more substantial changes, but then again a flattening out towards the end, where things are not getting worse. Well, it does go up a little bit, but again, I don't think we should pay too much attention to that. They're not getting worse, but the trend towards an improvement does appear to have stopped. So if we think about what happened, then I think if we split it into birth cohorts born before the 50s and after the 50s, we get this picture, which is to say a lot of good things were happening to the earlier born cohorts. There was more upward mobility, less downward mobility. The associations between O and D and O and E were both weakening. But for the cohorts born after that, There has been some worsening of the situation for men, especially in terms of absolute mobility, but no change then in relative mobility, either for men or for women. And so what I want to do then is just look in a bit more detail about why these things seem to have changed. And why did upward mobility stop increasing? Most of that upward mobility was actually driven by people moving up into these top two classes, the service classes, 1 and 2. And what this picture shows is the share of people in that class in destinations, that's the solid line, and in class origins, which is the bottom line. And upward mobility increased in the earlier cohorts because there were more people in the service class destinations than there were in service class origins. Right? That was the upward mobility. But as we go through to the later cohorts, you begin to see a much more marked increase in the share of people who come from service class origins. Right? So Sweden is a good example. So by the most recent cohort, origins and destinations in the service class are almost in balance. They're almost equal. So in a sense, what was happening here was that there was a supply of service class positions as destinations, and the demand rather, and the supply of people who were coming from service class origins was smaller than it, which allowed scope for people to be upwardly mobile. But this later growth in service class origins is partly driven, of course, by that earlier increase, because the people who benefited from that upward mobility then were the parents of the people in the later cohorts, at least to a certain extent. And this meant that in the later cohorts, origins in service class 1 and 2 are growing faster than destinations in service class 1 and 2. And that's essentially why the pattern of upward mobility stalled. You get the same shift actually in the balance of supply and demand if you look at education. So this is the 5 countries. The darker bar is the ratio of people in the service class 1 and 2 to the proportion who had got tertiary education. So in France, there were 4 times more people going into the service class than had acquired a university education. But if you look at the most recent, I think that's the most recent cohort, you can see that in France the ratio is 1. So if you want to think of it that way, every position in the service class could be taken by someone who had a degree. There's no scope for anybody who didn't have a degree to move into the service class. Whereas, of course, in earlier generations, in earlier cohorts, there was. This is the same picture for women, and it's pretty much the same story, except there's more growth, continued growth in the destinations, service class destinations for women than there was for men, which is why you don't see the same dying out of the trend to upward mobility. And then this is the same ratio of positions in 1 and 2 to the proportion of people who had tertiary education. And again, they're pretty much in balance now in the most recent cohorts. Okay, in intergenerational mobility, we usually treat those kinds of structural changes under the heading of absolute mobility. And we think of social fluidity as all about odds ratios, and there's almost a kind of an unwritten rule that never the two should meet. But actually we know in real life that if there's big structural change, this is also likely to affect equality of opportunity. And so what we're showing here is the odds ratio of entering the service class for people who were not born in there relative to staying in the service class for those people who were born into it. So essentially what we're seeing here is that the service class is becoming more open to people from non-service origins. So not only is there a growth in the size of those classes, there's more equality in the chances of people ending up in those classes. And again, we see this familiar now kind of downward pattern with a bit of flattening out in some countries towards the end. And why did that happen? Well, as the service class expanded, the odds of people born into it staying there, which is what's shown in the solid line, they remained roughly constant. But the odds of people who were not born into it entering the service class, they increased, right? So that's the bottom line. So the gap between the two lines is narrowing. And that is what's driving that odds ratio downwards, meaning that the opportunity to be in the service class as an adult is becoming more equally distributed, or became more equally distributed across society, as that bottom line got closer to the top line. But again, in the later cohorts, they're just parallel, right? So that process has stopped, and the lines are more or less parallel in the later cohorts. This is and then finally, this is plotting that odds ratio, or the change in that odds ratio of getting into the service class, together with the overall association between origins and destinations. And you can see that in some of the countries, it tracks, the two things track each other quite closely, which suggests that equalization of access to these top two classes may have been an important reason for why overall social fluidity increased during the 20th century. Okay, we can see the same things then for women. I think one interesting thing though is the US here, where we see that the odds of staying in the service class and the odds of entering the service class for women in the US, those two lines move parallel. So that odds ratio is not actually changing. And we see that in that red line where it just bounces around, but it ends up in pretty much the same place as it started at. And this is because of the parallel trend in those two lines. For women, access to the top two classes was not becoming more equal over time, as it was among men in the US and as it was among men and women in the European countries. So this is just showing that for several of these countries, the trends in overall origin-destination association and in the service class log odds are very similar. Okay. We started off by wondering what was the relationship between a weakening in the association between origins and education and the change in origins and destination association. So here we've plotted them. So the solid line is the OD association, which you already saw, and the dotted line is the OE associations. You already saw that, but you didn't see them for each country separately. But in each country, I think you can see that there is a pretty clear parallel trends with also this flattening out at the end, the US being the exception. So in the US among men, the OD association did weaken, but that doesn't seem to have had anything to do with changes in the equality of educational attainment with respect to social origins, because that didn't change really at all. So that's another way in which the US looks rather different. And then this is the same thing for women. And for women, in the US, there's not much of a trend in either of them, but they are more closely related than the case for men. But for the other countries, some of them are quite striking. French women, for example, the two trends track almost exactly. It's not quite as exact, of course, if you go to, let's say, as I showed you earlier, the moving averages, but at least overall there's quite a similarity in the trends. That was equalization. What about educational expansion? Well, there's a paper by Mike Hout from the 1980s in which he argues that changes in social fluidity in the US were driven essentially by the growth of college. And the argument here is, it's been taken up by many people subsequently, including me, but also a few years ago a paper by Florencia Torce. The idea here is that the association between origins and destinations is different for people with different levels of education. And what I've shown here for two of the countries, Germany and France, this is men in Germany and France, this is the degree of association between origins and destinations within each level of education relative to the lowest level. And there's a pretty clear downward trend. It's very clear in both countries, except that in Germany, 3B, which is the more academic or full tertiary education, the association goes up a little bit. But the argument here is that as education expands, the population is shifted from the left of these figures to the right of these figures, and so there's a compositional effect. There are more of them in those educational categories in which the association is weaker. And Hout argued that this had happened in the US, and this was an important explanation for weakening of the association between origins and destinations in the US. And of course, whether this is actually going to happen is going to depend upon whether, as cohorts move to the right of this distribution, this pattern of relativities persists, right? So, I mean, that's an issue. Actually, there is some work from France that has suggested it does persist. So there isn't, as it were, a three-way association between, or four-way between origin, destination, education, and, let's say, birth cohort or time. But clearly this existed for most of a large part of the 20th century in several of our countries. And so if you then plot the OD association against the share of the population with less than tertiary education, and I picked less than tertiary so the lines are both moving in the same direction rather than tertiary itself, you can see an equally strong association or relationship between the two, with the exception of Dutch men, where it doesn't really seem to be that close a tracking of the OD trend by the education trend. And for women, again, for Dutch women you don't see that, and for US women you don't see it, but everywhere else you do. So this kind of Hout compositional effect argument, there's prima facie evidence that it holds in most cases, but not for the Dutch and not for US women. And why doesn't it hold for the Netherlands? It doesn't hold for the Netherlands because in the Netherlands you don't get that picture. You don't get this differential association of origins and destinations across different levels of education. You do get it for US women, so I have to admit, I'm not sure why those two lines are so discrepant there. Okay. If we kind of put all of these things together, then this is just plotting the measures of the OE association as against measures of the OD association for all the birth cohorts in all the countries in our data. So that's all 8 countries. So that's really about 45 points, 46 points. And you can see there does appear to be a clear relationship between them. Likewise, for the percent tertiary, there's also a clear relationship between them. This is for men. If you remove US men from this, then the top relationship gets stronger, and the bottom relationship gets weaker, which is strongly suggesting that what was driving change in the US was not the equalization of education, but it was the expansion of education. These are the same pictures for women. So we can see that these things are all highly correlated, at least at the level of cohorts within countries. Okay, let me try and draw together then what we've found. So I've called this a tale of two halves. So we have got this, as I said, upgrading of class structures during the 20th century, particularly benefited those born up to 1950. This upgrading of the class structures, it actually was happening throughout the 20th century. And there is an argument, in fact, that some of the increase in education was actually a response to the change in class structures. But what's very noticeable is that the really rapid change in all the countries occurs at the same time, which is in the 30 years after the end of the Second World War, right, which is well known as a period of rapid economic growth. The French call it les Trente Glorieuses, and the Germans call it the Wirtschaftswunder. We don't, I think, have a name for it in English, but clearly from about the late 1940s, well, in Europe from the late 1940s, from the US a little bit earlier, up until the oil crises of the 70s, there was this massive expansion, of course, of positions in classes 1 and 2, and also labour shortages, increasing standards of living, rapid growth in GDP, especially in the European countries. That's really when they narrowed the gap between Europe and the United States. But that all came to an end, or at least it slowed down markedly after the 1970s. And so those cohorts born after the 1950s seem to have come onto the labour market just too late to have benefited from this. And so for them there was much less growth in 1 and 2 destinations. But they were more likely to have been born into classes 1 and 2 because their parents were the people who'd benefited from this rapid upward mobility. So one of the consequences of this is that the service class has become increasingly made up of people from service class origins. That's not saying that much because every class has become increasingly made up of people from service class origins because service class origins are so much bigger now than they used to be. But when people begin to complain about what's wrong with intergenerational mobility now, this is one of the things that they often say, right? All these positions at the top are being taken by the kids who come from the top. And that's true. That's actually true. And of course, it's correspondingly more difficult now for people to be upwardly mobile into that class because the supply of positions in those destinations is not much greater than the supply of people from origins in those destinations. And there's that similar shift in demand and supply in respect to education. So for earlier generations, you could get into these classes 1 and 2 without a tertiary qualification. Now it's almost completely out of the question. Okay, so that's absolute mobility. Then if we think of fluidity, or this measure of equality of opportunity, again, most of the growth in that occurred in the same cohorts, the cohorts born between the 20s and the 50s, and nothing much has changed since then. I've said that the increase in fluidity was mostly due to more equal access. I would say partly due. I think mostly due is overstating it. In fact, I was doing a bit more analyses last night and I thought, oh no, actually that mostly is wrong because other things were going on as well. But certainly this opening up of the top was an important part of the story. Let me just say that this is actually consistent with the period change that we found in earlier analyses. So in 2004, we had this book called Social Mobility in Europe. And what we did there was we did the wrong thing, I think, in retrospect, which is that we compared change over periods. We compared the 1970s with the 80s with the 90s. In fact, of course, as I've said in several things that I've written, change in mobility is essentially a cohort effect, right? It's a cohort replacement effect. But if you think about what we found there, which was big changes between the 70s and the 80s and less change between the 80s and the 90s, and you think of who was in our data, well, from moving from the 70s to the 80s, we lost people born between 1910 and 1920, and we gained people who were born between 1945 and 55. So we were losing a very rigid cohort, 1910 to 1920, with a very much less rigid, higher social fluidity cohort. And that was what was driving that change. But then from the 80s to the 90s, we lost the 20 to the 30 cohort, but they had begun to be more socially fluid. and they were being replaced by the 55 to 65 cohort. Well, that was the first cohort in which things were not changing anymore. So the gap there was correspondingly less. So I think that is at least consistent with what we found. I don't think, though, that this is consistent with either of the two main theories that traditionally are bandied about in studies of mobility, which is modernization and what John Goldthorpe has christened trendless fluctuation. Modernization theory says that as societies and economies develop, they become increasingly open and social fluidity steadily increases. There's a famous paper by Don Treiman that sets out all these implications very clearly. I think if you looked at the first half of the century, you would have said, yes, that's exactly what's happening. But then if you looked at the second half of the century, you might be more likely to say, oh, it's actually trendless fluctuation because it's just bouncing around. And so neither of them are completely consistent with those theories. Okay, let me just say a little bit, if I have time, about differences between men and women. I particularly like this picture. So remember that we've used as social origins father's occupation. And so this means that there was an awful lot of downward mobility by women in the early cohorts because of the extent of gender segregation in labour markets. It was almost forced to happen. But as that gender segregation has been diminished, so downward mobility among women has fallen faster than among men, and upward mobility has increased more quickly. So on the y-axis, we've got the upward mobility rates for men minus the rate for women. So you see that men are higher on the left-hand side and men are much lower on the right-hand side. But as the century has gone on, then both of those sets of figures have gone towards zero. So that at the end, you see in the US and also in Sweden that there is slightly more upward mobility among women than there is among men nowadays. And in fact, in France and the US, there's a larger share of women in classes 1 and 2 than there is of men. On the other hand, it's not all good news because more women are in class 2, the lower service class, than are in class 1. So, these things have improved greatly, but there are still remaining differences, of course. Okay, so these results, I think I've tried to persuade you, they're remarkably consistent for the European countries. Britain is not in this study, but we have done some work on Britain and we find a very similar picture for Britain. Italy follows a similar pattern, and so does Spain, but in Spain it all happens later. Right? So if you think of this point where things get good and then they stop being good, Spain is still on that part of the curve where things are getting better, or at least in our data. Spain didn't really benefit from the post-war period, but it did start to develop rapidly in the 1970s, and so it happens. And then, as we've gone along, I've pointed out some of the divergences in the US from what we might call the West European pattern. I think maybe the most important thing is that equalization of education seems to have been much less important in the US, and expansion seems to have played a bigger role. So are these really effects or are they just associations? Well, I'm not actually, I think, in a position to answer that question yet. But it's clear that both equalization and expansion have gone together with greater fluidity. And when you think about it, education is, or class destination is measured on average in our data around age 44 to 46. Right? Education is completed at least 20 years earlier than that. So if there isn't a causal relationship, the question arises, what is it then that could cause this association over a 20-year period? What other thing could be causing that association? But because all these things were happening together, it is difficult, as I said there, to distinguish the role of education from the role of structural change. But in some analysis that we've done, the effect of education on fluidity does seem to be robust to controls for structural change, rates of upward mobility, GDP growth, and so on. Okay, one thing that I think we know is intergenerational mobility has become a political topic in a way that it never was, up until about, as I said, 20 years ago. This is a quotation from Gordon Brown, who was, at that point, the British Prime Minister. And you can see what he says, equating social mobility with social justice. This is a very common theme, at least in the British rhetoric. That was before the 2010 election, which he lost. He was then replaced by this man, David Cameron, and this is what he said about Britain's social mobility problem. I just would like to point out that sentence in the middle. Listen to this. Britain has the lowest social mobility in the developed world, which is nonsense. Of course, actually, Britain is one of the more fluid countries. Of course, nobody in Britain wants to believe that, but it is actually. It's much more fluid than Germany, France, Italy. But again, it's another example of the politics of intergenerational mobility. And then finally, we come to Obama, who said this about. I mean, he said many things about intergenerational mobility, but this is one of them. I like to compare this with the previous two quotations, because this is really professorial, isn't it? Like lots of numbers, you know, whereas the others are just like, this is unacceptable, you know, we have to do something about it. But yeah, so it has become, as you all know, it has become the Trump quote. Yeah, I was going to put it up, but I thought, you know, you shouldn't really use offensive language. You know? Anyway, okay, so you know, they're all concerned with the problems of intergenerational mobility. What does all of this stuff suggest about, you know, what might happen in the future? Let me say at once that it's important to stress that intergenerational mobility in terms of social fluidity has not worsened, right? It's much better now than it was 100 years ago. What's happened in the more recent cohorts is that it hasn't changed. It hasn't continued to improve. It improved, now the improvement has stopped. But it's not that things are actually getting worse, which is something I think that you often hear. Of course, with the proviso that we're talking about those cohorts, right? So the later cohorts, we can't say anything. We can't say anything about. Essentially then, I think what I've been trying to say is there have been three factors that seem to have been related to the improvements in social fluidity. Structural change, the growth of classes 1 and 2, educational equalization, and educational expansion. Can we say anything about what might happen in the future in regards to those three when we're thinking about what might happen to equality of opportunity in the future? So let's begin with structural change. This is a quote from John Goldthorpe and Michelle Jackson back in 2007, which is very pessimistic about this. They are really concerned with rates of absolute mobility, movement up. And they're saying that this was a one-off thing, right? This happened in the 20th century. They don't think it's going to happen again. And if we want to increase intergenerational mobility, absolute mobility, it's going to have to be through increasing social fluidity. But increasing social fluidity is, of course, in that context then, with no structural change, it is a zero-sum game, right? You can only go up if I come down. And, of course, that is a much more difficult situation than the one that prevailed in the 20th century. What about educational equalization? Well, we've seen that educational equalization sort of stopped happening in many cases. I think it's important to think about the difference from today than what things were like 100 years ago. Essentially, this improvement, this educational equalization in the 20th century was caused by people moving from a few years of primary education into more years of primary education or into lower secondary education. So you had large proportions of the population with very low levels of education. We saw that in the case of France. And this equalization has actually been right down at the bottom, right? So it's been a mass of people who have improved their education. It's become less tied to their social origins, but right down at the bottom of the distribution. Nowadays, I think when we're talking about improving equality of outcomes in education, we're essentially talking about a different situation, which is where a rather smaller share of the population are the ones whose educational attainment has to be increased. And to a large extent, whereas in the early 20th century this was a cross-section, it was obviously the bottom of the class structure, but it was a cross-section. Now, of course, these people who are at the most difficult positions have in a sense been both negatively selected and they face obstacles that were not there at the beginning of the 20th century. So they've been negatively selected in the sense that these are the children of families that for some reason or other didn't benefit from this big upgrading. And it may be nothing to do with them, it may be to do with their circumstances, but that's a very different situation. I mean, many of them are immigrants, so they couldn't have benefited from that. But it's a very different situation, I think, to the one that I've been talking about in the 20th century. And then finally, educational expansion. Well, in our data, this is for Germany, we actually don't see a lot of educational expansion that has happened more recently. This is the number of students and the share of the cohort who are university students in Germany. Our data cover the light blue bars, right? So you can see that since then there's been a continued massive expansion of tertiary education in Germany. So if we're looking for a kind of of the three things that I looked at, I think this is the one that perhaps has the greatest potential to maintain equality of opportunity, even if not to increase it. But that is, of course, with the proviso that this differential association at different levels of education can persist even in the face of this massive expansion, which it may or it may not. We just don't know. So let me just end by saying that whether we think history can be a guide to the future, I have to say I think it's very doubtful in this case. By looking, I think, at different periods in the 20th century, we could come to very different conclusions. I mean, I said that about modernization theory versus trendless fluctuations. And what happened in the 20th century was a very specific thing. You could almost say it was a kind of a one-off, really a one-off shift in the whole structure of society. So perhaps we began this by asking whether we could learn anything about policy or about what to do in the future from looking at what had happened in the past. And I think, to be honest, that the lesson is that we need to be very cautious about what guide the past can provide to the future. Okay, thank you.